Greetings. This is I, your king again, Clifford Jefferson, descendant from Godfrey, 5th Caliban Jew, son of folk, ruler of Jerusalem. I am the reincarnation of King Edgar the Peaceful, known as the King of Peace. We know Godfrey means peaceful territory. So King Edgar was the King of Peace, and he was the ruler of a peaceful territory, which we know was all of Albion, or the Empire Albion, which we exist on today. Always beside me is Archbishop Belmont from the House of Belmont and called Judah, Bishop Murphy from the House of Murphy, here to give honor to our forefathers who we know as saints and martyrs from time immemorial. So I'll let the brothers say a couple of words before we get into this marvelous lesson. I digress.
Greetings again, brothers and sisters from the Kingdom of Empire of Albion. It's I, Archbishop Belmont from the illustrious House of Belmont. And this is part 2 for this beautiful lesson to kick off the Berber New Year, which is headed as our King's solar return. January 14, 2972 is going to be that. But once again, this lesson is going to open up the minds of many of our brothers and sisters who haven't really got an opportunity to really let this information digest and change them, because you're not supposed to change the information. The information is supposed to change you, and it's supposed to transform you to step into who you truly are and not what you want to be. Because so far, our brothers and sisters today are suffering because they're trying to be something that they're not. And as long as you continue to try to be something that you're not, you're going to continue to stay in the form of stress. And as we're showing you today, that form of stress is what? It's been in hell. And you've been in hell because you're not owning up to the understanding that you have to have the consciousness of the king, or the king's conscious, knowing that he's back, which is natural law. And the fact that you don't know that is going to keep you into a state of stress and illness. So we're here as the tacticians, as the healers, to come and bring you what you need, so that way you can come up out of that form of sickness, which is we're going to call madness, depression, and we're going to uplift you. And if you really want to truly be uplifted, you will come this way. So with that being said, I leave the rest of the introduction to Noble C.A. Murphy from the Noble House of Murphy.
Gratitude, Archbishop. Peace and love, everyone. Peace and love, everyone. That's the sound of my voice. Greetings and gratitude. I'm honored to be here again with the King's Bench for part 2 of this marvelous lesson. Overstanding, understanding, the ignorance of law is no excuse, and natural law applies to all sentient, upright beings. So what is the divine law that is currently governing your house? And, as we go through these marvelous lessons, I ask you to open your eyes, ears, those who have ears, let them hear. That your history and law does go hand in hand. And this is a history and trust put in place by your forefathers, heir and tails. So we greet you in love, truth, peace, and hope that you can receive the justice that your estate truly deserves under your birthright. So with that being said, I love you. This is Archbishop A.C.A. Murphy, chiming in, and let's get into this lesson one more again. Peace.
Well said. But both bishops from their respective house. Is I, your king again, coming to drop the knowledge that we all need in order to raise ourselves out of hell. Once again, to recap what we discussed in part 1 was a reiteration of how important it is to understand the Settlement Act of 1701 in regards to the angelic and the Protestant faiths who would now be inhabited as colonists, set plantations on what we call the 13 colonies, known as the British colonies, now called America. As we know, as I stated, the original contract is 1606, dealing with the de facto King James, allowing such a grant to be given to such a foreigner, which is the case. But we know along with those grants came encumbrances, which have been violated by way of enslavement of the indigenous English Anglo-Saxon Berbers, which is a violation of the 1606 Charter, clause 15, 16, and 17. And this is a result of the subjugation of their estate by way of the Settlement Act of 1701, which resulted in the Plantation Act of 1740 and the Naturalization Act of 1740 for the settlement of the Protestant and the Anglican faith who established these colonies here in what we call now North America, which the Methodist Church and the African Methodist Church are branches of them. And as we can see that the original habitants of those who were forced to adopt such a religion were trying to make their way back to the Church of England, which was reformed by those who took over our state, known as the House of Tudors. So it's our job as descendants of the Plantagenet crown who established the Angevin crown, which are our heirs and successors. And we are here to combine and reattach that lineage based off the understanding or overstanding that has been missing as a result, which was done by the reformation of the English ancestral rights in lieu of hereditaries, which is based off agnatic succession, which the House of Stuart and the House of Tudors failed to produce a male-born heir. I'm a male-born heir. My mother, my grandmother, and my grandmother just happened to be named Ruth. And we know the abstract story about Jesus Christ, his grandmother was named Ruth. And we know that I have proven who I am by way of the surname Jefferson, because as we know, I was born in that miraculous day on the New Year, January the 14th. So you might as well call me Baby New Year. I don't have no big ears though, but just call me the Baby New Year. And, you know, Baby New Year had an afro. I ain't got an afro. It should be coming back shortly though. But all jokes aside, for the Berber New Year, the New Year has always been January 14th. And this goes back to the ancient Berbers. The New Year's called Yen and there. It was the institution of the Gregorian calendar in 1582 by Pope Gregory XIII that brought in the institution of a Gregorian year as being January the 1st. And as we know, and as we're going to see with today's lesson, that all the faiths dealing with African Methodism, Protestant Anglicanism, all this were instituted with the creation of what we call the first century Christianity, which goes back to first 1 BC, 1 AD, which is in the Berber year, the time of King Edward the Peaceful, 950, 951. So without further ado, let's get started. Do that. I'm about to go plug my computer in Archbishop. Just read for me.
Okay. And point of interest, and before we go ahead and get started, I want to go ahead and leave off or finish up some of what we were speaking about on part 1. And this is very imperative to hear what I'm going to say right here. I'm just going to go ahead and read it. And it says the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America, later known simply as the Episcopal Church USA, with the old familiar Elizabethan era Old English text and the Book of Common Prayer, with some minor revisions in the first American edition of 1789, replacing prayers for His Royal Majesty, the King and his ministers, to those for the new president, members of the Congress, governors, and lawful state commonwealth officials. All right. So they're changing things up. What we were utilizing, or what you were utilizing back in the Church of England, to now start to reflect this new so-called form of government. All right. So it says, as many Black people and Methodists in Philadelphia had already been Anglicans since the 1740s. Now, we just told you about the Plantation Act. We just told you about the Legal Act of 1740, and they're letting you know that the so-called Black people or Methodists in Philadelphia were Anglicans since the 1740s. So this is right before the so-called Treaty of Paris of 1783 or the so-called Royal Proclamation of 1763. All right. It was only during the American Revolutionary War, 1775, 1783, and with the part-time occupation of Philadelphia as the Patriots' rebels capital by the British Army, that drove out most of the old English British ministers of the old Anglican faith.
Wow.
So what they're saying, they're telling you that the so-called rebels, we're going to call these the folks who support the Republic. These are the ones who forced out your English ancestors who were actually working or still trying to keep the faith of who we were going back to time immemorial as English people, or as you can see this time, there was transition into so-called the Anglican faith, but they were still trying to hold on to whatever it was that still maintained who we were. All right. Now it says this last part, they founded the African Church, which we told you, with Absalom Jones leading services and preaching the word. It was accepted as a parish congregation and opened its doors on July 17, 1794, known as the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. The following year of 1795, the now Reverend Mr. Absalom Jones was ordained as deacon, and 9 years later, in 1804, he became the first Black person ordained in the United States as a priest, presbyter, pastor of the Episcopal Church in USA. All right. Any words you want to give that, King?
Yes. Once again, we know when you get into the Funding Act and the Residency Act of 1790, this deals with the United States government now. All right. What was done in 1740 with the Plantation Act and the Naturalization Act of the Protestant and Anglican faith who broke away from the Roman Catholic faith now have changed from that to now, because they moved from the colonies, i.e. the plantations, to now become states. This came by way of what we call the Funding Act and the Residency Act of 1790, okay? The Residency Act and the Funding Act of 1790 of these same colonies who now became states.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that's it.
All right, so now let's go ahead and get to the next part. After we read this part where it says, Allen and others want to continue in the more simpler and evangelical Methodist practices inspired by George Whitefield, John Wesley, and his brothers Charles Wesley. Now we know that the Methodist church was split away from the Church of England after so-called John Wesley passed away. All right, and it says practices and traditions that had originally been brought from England by Francis Asbury, Robert Starbridge, and interpreted in America by Daniel Coke, Daniel Alexander Phelps. All right, so now let's go ahead and get to Prince Hall Freemasonry.
Did we get to the part when he said that he was trying to get back to the Church of England? Did we pass that?
Oh no, hold on. Let's get. I think that's in.
What's that? Richard Allen. You say he was trying to get back to the
church.
Church.
Yeah, I think this is Richard Allen. This is the Free African Society right now. Hold on. So what I was just reading that. Oh, Richard Allen, get back. Here we go.
Yes, point of interest. We did read it. We're going to reiterate it. Richard Allen of the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Oh, that's what it was, the Episcopal Church. Let me see. This is Richard. Okay, yeah,
You're in the right place.
All right. Okay.
Give us a second, y'all. And spoke about he wanted to get back to the spiritual of the Church of England.
I think that was at the top then. I think, okay. Here we go. All right, so it's right here. It says, over time, most of the FAS members chose to return to the spiritual home of their youth and forefathers and affiliate with the neighborhood parishes of the former Church of England as it slowly recovered from the wartime bitterness of the Revolution after the British ministry government ending the war in the Treaty of Paris ratified in 1783 by the Confederation Congress in Annapolis.
Okay, yeah, we actually did read that. All right, cool.
Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and get to Prince Hall. All right, now this is very important, very, very important, because once again, we know a lot of these organizations got started based off of the free Masonic orders. And within these orders is what a lot of the false history or false narratives have been created to be planted into the world today, as you see what's caused this chaos or this confusion that we're living. But we're going to go ahead and read it for yourself so that way you can see that we're not just making this stuff up. Okay, it says Prince Hall was an abolitionist and leader in the free Black community in Boston. He founded Prince Hall Freemasonry and lobbied for education rights for African-American children. He was also active in the Back to Africa movement. Let's take a look at this Back to Africa movement first. Oops, excuse me, here we go.
Listen, y'all. Y'all better listen.
Back to Africa movement. It says, the Back to Africa movement was based on a widespread belief among some European Americans in the 18th and 19th century United States that African Americans would want to return to the continent of Africa. in general, the political movement was an overwhelming failure. For very few former slaves wanted to move to Africa. The small number of freed slaves who did settle in Africa, some under duress, initially faced brutal conditions.
Read that again, Archbishop.
It said, and the Back to Africa movement was based on a widespread belief among some European Americans in the 18th to 19th century United States that African Americans would want to return to the continent of Africa. Now, remember, we already told you that these so-called Africans were ancient Berbers, and we showed you too that the Negroes were also known as Native Americans. So if they were known as Native Americans, then that means that the Berbers are the original people to so-called America, which we know is a British colony, which we know is actually doing business in the Kingdom of England. But let's finish.
Exactly.
So
Let
it
me
says,
speak on that right quick.
Go ahead.
Very key point, because we have to look at what we're reading. It says the Back to Africa movement was based on a widespread belief among some European
Americans.
America, before they became America, was colonies.
Mm-hmm.
All right, European colonies.
America, de facto.
Now listen what they're saying. It says essentially that the European Americans in the 18th century, this is what their belief that the inhabitants here might want to go back to Africa, since they were classified as African American by the European Americans. Before they was Americans, you were called colonies. So how can you be African American when America is a modern term and predated by colonies?
And point of interest that, why would a European American all of a sudden belief among this widespread, oh, you want to go back to Africa? Because they were into piracy. They were into selling of, people who are into the business. We got to understand that criminal enterprise doesn't change the measure of, this was a criminal enterprise, piracy, that was no longer sanctioned under privateering. Now it was outlawed, but people were still making bank off of it. And they, the selling of people, was now a trickery done by changing their name and likeness. I'm like, all right, we grabbed you from here to go change you into these people and then subjugate you. So that the act of piracy was still prevalent in this time.
Mm-hmm.
And then they said the 18th and 19th century. That's 1700s.
1700s. That's right after so-called after the abolition. Hold on, before Great Britain gave everything back. That's when all this stuff was taking place. So technically, slavery was already over with because common recovery was abolished.
Yes, sir.
So now common recovery was abolished for the English heirs. Only thing now, because remember, we're descendants of so-called indentured servants or prisoners of war at this point. So we didn't have any true fully understanding of who we were because the information was supposed to have been taught through the churches. But the churches were being reformed and they were teaching us something else.
The churches have been encumbered because they've gotten away completely from if they had been keeping up with their English law and hereditaments, they would have been able to see themselves being misrepresented. I always like that song by Stevie Wonder. We must not go back to being a misrepresented people, because once someone else can misrepresent you, and that's what these courts of exchequer please do, they take your name and likeness and misrepresent you. And if you don't proclaim or declare who you are, then you are subject under Nisi Prius.
Well said.
Well said.
Yeah. And that's beautiful because once again, as it stated with the Methodist Church, that Absalom wanted to go back to the history concerning the spirituality of the ancient Church of England.
Absolutely.
All right, the ancient Church of England. You know what I'm saying? Because he was influenced by this Back to Africa movement. He was still subject to the same Back to Africa movement because these people who influenced him were European Americans. And we know the European Americans were the 13 colonies, and the original 13 colonies were those who composed of those colonies that were subject in the territory called Boston, Massachusetts, where the Revolutionary took place.
Exactly. Right? A point of interest, King. One last thing: states versus colonies. Anyone qualifying themselves to be under a state or in a state is de facto opposed to a colony, as for states and republics are in direct opposition to monarchies.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. That's a breach of contact. Dormant versus Woodward.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the Revolutionary War, it did not nullify the sanctity of a contract.
And in this
And
case,
anything that violates the laws of contract is null and void. Fluffy versus Peck, Holmes versus Walton.
Y'all better listen.
Yeah, better pay attention, because once again, even those court cases are only going to be really applicable to the English heirs.
Yes, sir.
You have no remedy,
realize that.
No salvation outside of the church. You know, when they try to separate the church from the state, they're trying to tell you, like, you know, they're separating your body of knowledge from its applicability. You have no rights that they should respect, because you cannot attach your hereditaments to entail above the court of exchequer of pleas, which is hell.
Absolutely. Well said. And
that's called chancery. Because why? Because any court outside of chancery court is not a court that has proper jurisdiction pertaining to you.
Thank you.
You know what I'm saying? The only court that has jurisdiction to hear matters in regards to you are chancery courts, because you are protected by the king's consciousness. The king's consciousness has not been upheld here in North America because they've not been operating under the courts of chancery. That has been removed to what we call courts of common pleas, and the matters dealing with legal guardianship over property. It could be your child, it could be your personal property, it could be your movable property. Why? Because the states takes
jurisdiction
as a result of its chiefs.
Mm-hmm.
When there's no heir or successor, everything gets chiefed back to the state. I don't give a damn what you call it. You can call it ward of the state, minor, etc. All these things are subject to the state under what we call the influence of Christianity. And Christianity was created due to the institution of Angelicism, Protestantism, which all goes back to Tacitus and Flavius Josephus, which we're going to get into. All right, so go back to the first century. I mean, to the.
I just want to say this last part, and as once again, this Back to Africa movement, it was a failure. And like I said again, as the failure became known in the United States in the 1820s, remember, we was in so-called in slavery at this point, it spawned and energized the abolitionist movement. All right, so that's where you get your abolitionists coming in and start trying to do what? Try to so-called free the heirs, but place us back to Africa movement.
Yeah, Freeman burial and all this.
Exactly.
Point of interest. The reason, I mean, let's qualify it. If you are claiming descendancy in Africa and they're saying that the Dred Scott, that there are no rights that anybody from Africa that they have that they should respect, and you go into their jurisdictions, you ask why you don't get any remedy. You know, as someone who's challenged their jurisdiction and sought remedy and came up with nothing, ask people who are in their jurisdiction now, currently wanting to use treaty and such, and still expecting remedy. They have no right, that you have no rights that they should respect under their citizen clauses under the Dred Scott. So it's important to perpetuate. It's important to perpetuate a narrative and to sell the narrative. You know, take a hustler sells anything, right? And when the game of commerce of high seas now is selling misinformation, so all those who are willing to buy into it are left out at sea. So this is an awesome thing that the King's Bench is doing by breaking down the different sects, or those that were holding your trust, that have betrayed your trust in a sense. You've been trusted your leaders to give you the truth, but ignorance to law is no excuse. So you yourself, every tongue shall confess, every knee shall bow. So now you yourself have to carry your own cross. You got to study to show yourself approved. Ignorance to law is no excuse. So you cannot go to a preacher or a president or a deacon for your salvation. You yourself have to study to show yourselves approved. To seek you first in the kingdom of heaven to inherit the throne. I yield the floor.
Well said. And I know a lot of y'all people out there assuming like, well, how this brother came to call himself a king. You must understand what a king is and what a king represents. You know, king authority rises from what we call kingship, which rises under authority of the crown. And as the crown, under the authority of the crown, involving the kingship, involves the king's realm, involving him, his officers, and his subjects. All right. Now, for all those assuming that this is abstract, it's not abstract, because we know as the king, the land must be held under allodial. Then it brings you into 46:3-6 of New Jersey Revised Statute, our present day statute, y'all, that says the land is no longer under feudal tenure, but allodial. So if the land is in allodial, then there must be a king here. How we know that? 46:3-2, because he says that the land will remain in free and common succus as under the King of England, or person or body corporate. That's called a corporation soul. Look that up. Corporation soul. That origin of the corporation soul, it means one person can hold office as a natural person and a corporate encompassing one. You have two types of corporation, corporation soul and aggregate. We're not an aggregate corporation soul. It's under a we're not a corporation aggregate. We're under a corporation soul held by one minor who operates under the corporation soul as a natural person and corporation, so that the heirship would transfer with what we call operation of law. So it has not done so because ain't no heir stepped up. So I have incorporated it under the laws of the state of New Jersey in regards to the right state under the charge of Great Britain, pursuant to the right state under the charge of Great Britain, which was held under authority by a king. And what king we talking about? King Godfrey the Fifth Caravan Jew, father of Henry II, son of John, the one who held the Magna Carta. That's why our rights are protected under Title 6, Chapter 1, Section 28. Rights stated under the Magna Carta. Why? Because no other state, township, bill has the right to use the right state under charge of Great Britain, because you got your own law or charter, and that's that state's constitution, state legislature, or ordinance.
Qualifying.
Well said.
Indeed. Look, qualifying statement that Magna Cartas are the predominant charter that is used to govern the English law in the American colonies. All of your American states use the Magna Carta to back their corporate charters de facto in lieu of royal charters granted by the king. I yield the floor.
Yeah. Well said. And as a result of you saying that, this is why I said that feudal tenure has been abolished. Your states tax the citizens. That's called feudal tenure, right? This was done on what we call tenants in chief, because they have to pay under the common courts of common exchequer. Common exchequer collect what? Debt for the king.
Debt for the king.
This is why all your citizens of any state within the United States pay the state. So we know the state, it has to pay the king. Why? Because the state operates under what we call courts of common pleas that deals with the subject to subject without the need of a king. But the state is in debt. Why? Because it has the national debt based off the debt it received through the Funding Act of 1790. Now, the result of the 1790 Funding Act resulted from you borrowing from the creditor, i.e. the Bank of England. And the creation of the Bank of England was established as for the government of the Kingdom of England, which goes back to 927, y'all. 927.
Yep.
So this is no joke. We're showing you modern day statutes that derive their authority from old legislation, we call common law. Because jurisdiction don't mean common law. It means law declared. That's what jurisdiction means. So when you're saying that the courts don't have jurisdiction, yes, they do. Why? Because you have not declared what law that protects you. You're using your protection by the law they declare.
Absolutely.
All right. It's not protected by any statute of legislation. It's based off case law. Stuff they make up every day. It's a case by case. We don't need that. Why? Because we got the law of our forefathers, protected by the King's conscience, which can only be held up in chancery. Why? Because he's aware of what we're talking about. That's his job. He's not a regular judge. He's a cleric mirror. He's a bishop. He only deals with guardianships of estates, inheritance, property, land, etc. And that can only belong to those who are inherited of entail estates, which is contrary to fee and simple. Fee and simple comes under common recovery. That brings up 46:3-10 of New Jersey Revised Statute that says that no court of law will entertain any issue regarding common recovery, and no way entail a bar issue of entail. What? So that means that if you have or claim to be an English heir of English ancestry, and you claim to have an estate based off entail, no court can deny you that right. Why? Because we know that's the case with us. Why? Because our case is moved from common courts of pleas to chancery.
Hey,
we
ask
showed
us
you
how
that.
we know.
That's
Ask
how we
us
just
how
showed
we
you that.
know.
And it said for what? For relief sought.
Relief sought.
Relief sought could not be given in the court of common pleas. Because
Exactly.
they don't want to give you anything. You at the mercy of them. But now we call upon our peers, our Lord. Why? Because we are their peers. We are the peers of the Lord, and the Lords are our peers. And Lords were gods.
Lords were gods. Yep.
All right, let's move on.
All right, and so once again, so as we saw, based off of Prince Hall, he's active in the Back to Africa movement. Let's go a little bit further. He tried to gain the place for New York's enslaved and free blacks in Freemasonry, education, and the military, which were some of the most crucial spheres of society in this time. Hall is considered the founder of Black Freemasonry in the United States, known today as Prince Hall Freemasonry. Hall formed the African Grand Lodge of North America. Now, remember, we just told you that he was a supporter of the Back to Africa, and we just told you that the Back to Africa, nobody wanted to go back because they weren't from there.
Mm-hmm.
All right, says Prince Hall.
That's funny. That's real funny.
Yeah, and he said he was an abolitionist. So once again, this is people who look like you who are trying to get you to go to a place that you didn't come from, and somehow they persuaded you to accept the identity of that place. But we're going to find out how that happened.
Wait, point of interest. I want to excuse the terminology, play devil's advocate for a change, because when people say, well, back to Africa, we understand we've done the succession of from Kemet to England. Okay, we've done that in our previous lesson, so we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We're saying you're governed by English law. English law is relegated from time immemorial. Sometimes you guys use time immemorial out of context. And time immemorial is relegated by English law 1189, July 6, 1189. So that means from that point on, it's Ixnay. So we qualified, from Kemet till now as it relates to the English people, the Anglo-Saxon Berbers. So we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. What we're saying is the English law that you're governed by was usurped by de facto peoples, businesses, etc. And you're now being estated instead of being under the pairs and parishes, provinces and colonies under the crown, protected by rights under royal charters. So don't think we confused. Don't you get confused. I just, like I said, wanted to make that clarity for all of you who are so in love with your African history that you would omit everything after that, Middle Ages, English, American, etc. So qualify your history by a proper timeline. I yield the floor.
Well said, Archbishop. Let me see.
All right. So before we start getting to the last part of Prince Hall, because we're going to go to Prince Hall Masonry, said Prince Hall was unanimously elected its Grand Master and served until his death in 1807. All right. And
hold on. Go back to where it said place of birth. Where is that? We were just reading.
Oh, it
right
says
at the bottom line.
It says there's confusion about his year of birth, place of birth, parents, and marriages, at least partly due to the fact that there was numerous Prince Halls during this time.
That's crazy.
All right, so let's see. His early life. Prince Hall was born between 1735 and 1738. His place of birth and parents are also unclear. Prince Hall mentioned in his writings that New England was his homeland.
What? Y'all know about New England, right? I hope y'all know about New England.
And I hope you know that
this goes back to the Puritans who thought that the English church need to be revived. All right, another branch who thought that the English church need to be reformed.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Archbishop.
It says the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, that's Boston, in its proceedings of 1906 opted for 1738. Relying on a letter from Reverend Jeremy Belknap, a founder of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Prince Hall's birthday is traditionally celebrated on September 14th. Hall's early years are unclear. Historian Charles H. Wesley theorized that by age 11, Prince Hall was enslaved or in service to Boston tanner William Hall, and by 1770 was a free literate man and had been also accounted as a free man. It was through William Hall that Prince learned how to process and dress leather. Inside Prince Hall, author and historian David L. Gray states that he was unable to find an official historical record of the manumission. Hall identified as able to read and write may have been self-taught or like other enslaved people and free blacks in New England, he may have had assistance. His family and work life. Now, after this, then we're going to go get to the Freemasonry part. Hall joined the Congregational Church in 1762 at 27 years of age. Now, remember, we already spoke that how the people who was living at the church at the time knew that they were still connected to the Church of England. All right. It says he married an enslaved woman named Sarah Ritchie, or Richery, who died in 1769. Hall married Flora Gibbs of Gloucester in 1770. All right. And the rest of this, like I said, we're not going to worry about. Let's just get to
Revolutionary War, yeah.
The Revolutionary War. It says Hall encouraged enslaved and freed blacks to serve the American colonial military. He believed that if blacks were involved in the founding of the new nation, remember, America is a new nation at this time, it would aid in the attainment of freedom for all blacks. Hall proposed that the Massachusetts Committee of Safety allow blacks to join the military. He and fellow supporters petitioned compared to intolerable acts with the enslavement of blacks. Their proposal was declined. England issued a proclamation that guaranteed freedom to blacks who enlisted in the British Army. Once the British Army filled its ranks with black troops, the Continental Army reversed its decision and allowed blacks into the military. It is believed, but not certain, that Hall was one of the 6 Prince Halls from Massachusetts to serve during the war. Having served—
Go back to England. Now hit England. Very important.
Point of interest, while you get that, this is reflected by the movie Glory, y'all. Denzel Washington, the movie Glory. This is reflected in that story when England was willing to offer you some bit of freedoms through service after military service, and then after that, America said, "All right, we'll let y'all come."
We'll let you come in. Yep.
Now today is the same and similar conflict of choices. Oh, want to pick the lesser of two evils? Want to pick the Democrat over? Listen, you at the same time you're being challenged with the same question over generations, and you're getting, I dare to say, you may not be choosing correctly. Why? Because your heirship or your rights are protected under your birthrights, not under any sort of remedy that can be changed under stare decisis at any moment's notice. So that Civil War happened on a etherical level, inside your body, as well as a physical level outside in the world of choices, in the world of manifestation. Your choices now reflect that battle of which side to be on. But like I stated earlier, republics are a direct conflict to monarchies. So when it says choose this day whom you shall serve, you are in service of your family, your rights, you're into your birthright. That is your name. What do you say? I do it for my last name. You are in service of your people, and they had left. They left this rights. No hybrid European who created that's not them. That's not there. They were trustees who were supposed to do right, who did wrong, who betrayed the trust. So they're held in dishonor. So as they'll suffer their own karmatic consequences for their lack of truth and trusted lack of trust that they were put in position. But as we reflect this knowledge to you of the people who were held in place, your clergy and your assemblymen were all under de facto charters, corporate charters, held in place as gatekeepers, opposed to that of freeing you with real history and knowledge. So these reformations were providing misinformation as to your heirship. I yield.
Well said.
Yeah.
Go back to the next one, Archbishop, where you were just at. Now we know England, and England starts from 927 with Atherton. All right. Now, as we can see, it said England issued a proclamation that guarantees freedom to blacks who enlisted in the British Army. Now, British armies are not English armies.
Exactly.
British armies are armies fighting on using the English authority to fight on behalf of the English, but they are not English people because you're being by British army. British consists of the 13 colonies who were plantation colonies who broke away from England by way of de facto monarchs sitting on the throne of England. And because we know England was dissolved by way of the Treaty of Union in 1707. So there was no more kings of England doing anything. It was the monarchs of Scotland doing the thing on the throne of England without the England monarch being there.
Exactly.
That's the reason why this stuff is taking place.
Exactly. Well said.
All right.
All right. So it says, having served during the Revolutionary War, many African Americans expected but did not receive racial equality when the war ended. So they're using you once again as a pawn. Like say, yeah, we'll give you something, but once it's done and over, all right, back to work. All right. So what the
what they did, Queen British was occupying the throne and the guaranteeing rights for slaves to help them, assist them against the new descending American colony. And this is because he was a de facto monarch. So once his goal was accomplished, he just simply enslaved them again.
Yep.
And then give them to the principles that which they were guaranteed based off them being affiliated with the original Church of England, based off the original practice, going back to the spiritual practice, which was what we call the visible church.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. All right. And so now in the last part of this, it says, Prince Hall, says, with the intention of proving the lives of fellow African Americans, Prince Hall collaborated with others to propose legislation for equal rights. He also hosted community events such as Blah, educational forums, theater events to improve the lives of Blacks, but none as important. Many of the original members of the African Masonic Lodge had served during the Revolutionary War. Okay, so now let's get to Prince Hall Masonry. All right, it says Prince Hall Freemasonry is a branch of North African Freemasonry for African Americans founded by Prince Hall on September 29, 1784. There are two main branches of Prince Hall Freemasonry: the independent state Prince Hall Grand Lodges, most of which are recognized by regular Masonic jurisdictions, and those under the jurisdiction of National Grand Lodge. Prince Hall Freemasonry is the oldest and the largest predominantly African American fraternity in the nation. Okay.
Stop. Now, this is a year after they declared their independence from Great Britain, 1783. Now it's 1784, a year later. You got the largest Prince Hall Masonry of so people call Black people.
Yep. All right, so we're going to go straight down to what's important, the Grand Lodge of England. All right, so it says, unable to create a charter, they applied to the Grand Lodge of England. The Grand Master of the Premier Grand Lodge of England, HRH, the Duke of Cumberland, issued the charter for African Lodge number 459, September 29, 1784, later renamed African Lodge number 1. The lodge was the country's first African Masonic lodge. Due to the African Lodge's popularity and Prince Hall's leadership, the Grand Lodge of England made Hall a provincial Grand Master on January 27, 1791. His responsibilities included reporting on the condition of lodges in the Boston area. 6 years later, on March 22nd, 1797, Prince Hall organized a lodge in Philadelphia called African Lodge number 459 under Prince Hall's charter. They later received their own charter. On June 25th, 1797, he organized African Lodge, later known as Haram Lodge number 3 at Providence, Rhode Island. And then author, historian James Sidbury said, Prince Hall and those who joined him to found Boston's African Masonic Lodge built a fundamentally new African movement on a pre-existing institutional foundation. Within that movement, they asserted emotional, mythical, and genealogical links to the continent of Africa and its people.
Read that again.
It says, Prince Hall and those who joined him to found Boston's African Masonic Lodge built a fundamentally new African movement. Now that's that back to Africa movement, new African movement on a pre-existing institutional foundation that's been called Africans or African Americans. Within that movement, they asserted emotional, mythical, and genealogical links to the continent of Africa and its people.
Okay, let's talk about this for a minute. You know that the root of these lodges are stemmed back from the authority granted by de facto monarchs ruling under what we call the jurisdiction under what we call New England, because Massachusetts was in New England. All right. Now we know that these authority granted by the inhabitants of Massachusetts who set up the first African lodge were influenced by the Christianity. And this is why the Christianity that were practiced today is a result of what were being practiced in these lodges instituted by those practitioners who created these lodges. And we know that these lodges go back to these churches that were established under what we call the Methodist Church. Free African Americans back to the Methodist Church, on back to the Protestants, on back to the Anglicans, who were all descended from Roman Catholics. Now, as we said, all this is taking place in the year between 1784 and 1790. From 1784 to 1790. So we know through 1784, they broke away from Great Britain. Now their main focus is on establishing the internal structure to get their stuff off the ground, which resulted in the funding of the 1790 Act in North America here, by way of what we call the Regency Act. So all the residents now who are subject to communities, including their slaves, are now creating their new customs, traditions, on ways of indoctrinating themselves so that way they can hold on to a faith that never existed, that can promulgate what we call the invisible church, contrast to the visible church, which we know with the English Church of England.